I am still a heart man. Let's go. Forge gang. Let's go. All right, so I'm back. I will be discussing life in ancient Egypt. What was daily life like for the pharaohs? The pharaohs who built the pyramids, who mummified their dead, who made complex incantations and special rituals. The Egyptians are known for making some of the best perfumes and best eye colorings in the world. Egyptian culture in ancient times was very well known for its extreme longevity, its high refinement, very, very early on in the history of man. There are quite a few Bible passages and references from the Greeks and Romans on the antiquity of Egypt. Egypt is a very, very ancient civilized culture, known very much for its longevity. But now I wish to pose to you, the listener, a riddle. I want to pose to you a riddle. And if you can answer this riddle by the end of this stream, I will do whatever you wish. I will do whatever you want. But you have to answer this riddle. This is the riddle. What goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet at noon, and 3 feet in the evening? So, what goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet at noon, and 3 feet in the evening? Can you answer this riddle? Pre-tell. Can you answer this riddle? I leave it up to you to find out what the riddle was. Dear viewer, can you tell me what the riddle is? So now I will bring to you daily life in ancient Egypt. There are 30 dynasties that composed ancient Egypt. It is so remotely old and so antique that even the Greeks and Romans considered Egypt to be ancient, even in their day. And the rule of Cleopatra in the 1st century BC is closer to our time than the pyramids. The pyramids were 2,700 years old when Cleopatra ruled and when she conspired with Mark Antony against Augustus Caesar. That is correct, Code of Truth. It is the riddle of the Sphinx. Now tell me your wish. What do you desire most from the Imperator of Forge? So anyways, the first thing to come to mind is that the Egyptians did not call themselves the Egyptians. That was a name the Romans called them in the 1st or the 2nd century BC. Maybe the 3rd century BC. So the Egyptians did not call themselves Egyptians. That was something that the Romans got from the Greeks The Romans called them Egyptians, and they called the country Egypt after some earlier Greek name that Herodotus made. But anyways, I now present the history and life of ancient Egypt. What were the manners, pray tell, of the Egyptians from 3200 BC to about 1000 or 900 BC? The brief history of Egypt. And this is the country of Egypt. This is the modern country. In ancient times, it was much different. The Egyptian state is one of the oldest on earth. The story of Egypt begins around 3500 BC, from the foundation of the first settlements. The word Egypt is of Greek origin and originally pronounced Egyptos, Egyptos. The capital of Egypt was the city Memphis. In 305 BC, Egypt passed into the hands of one of Alexander the Great's generals, by the name of Ptolemy, one of the 4 generals under Alexander the Great, who laid the foundation for the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled for 300 years. The last of the Ptolemaic dynasty was Queen Cleopatra. After her death, Egypt was conquered by the Romans and turned into a province of the Roman Empire. The history of Egypt is divided into several stages: dynastic, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arabic, Ottoman, and modern. The beginning of the Egyptian state. So after the flood of Noah and the confounding of the languages or the tongues at the Tower of Babel, the confounding of the languages at Babel, the children of Shem, Ham, and Japheth scattered throughout the earth. One of the sons of Ham founded the Egyptian nation, and this happened probably not very long after the Tower of Babel. The beginning of the Egyptian state. Egyptian civilization originated in northeast Africa in the Nile River Valley, thanks to her abundant seasonal spills. In the 4th millennia BC, primitive communal tribes wandering along the Nile Valley for the purpose of hunting and gathering transformed into small settlements which were called nomes. Nomes. Gradually, the nomes united into 2 large kingdoms called Upper and Lower Egypt. The patroness of Upper Egypt was considered the goddess Falcon Nehbet, and Lower Egypt, the cobra goddess Wadjet. Near the end of the 4th millennium BC arose conflict between Upper and Lower Egypt, in which the northern kingdom, Upper Egypt, won. The lower one became part of it. That is, Lower Egypt was conquered and a single state was formed. The first ruler of United Egypt became Narmer, all right. The first pharaoh or the first ruler of United Egypt became Narmer, from which the so called Zero Dynasty began. The pharaonic stage or the dynastic stage of the history of Egypt. Near 3100 BC, with the rule of Pharaoh Meniza, begins the early or the Old Kingdom, begins the Old Kingdom era. This period is interesting in that the Egyptians invented the solar calendar, began to study the stars. They also had the basics of geometry and writing. And this is in 2800 BC. This is 2800 BC, and they already have star charts and basic geometry and writing mastered. This allowed the construction of the famous Egyptian pyramids to begin. The first of them became Pyramid Djazra, after which they erected the Great Pyramids of Giza. Near 2260 BC, or near 2260 BC, the decline of the Old Kingdom period begins, which has lasted for 200 years. This time is called the First Transition Period. The reason for the decline was the discontent of the people caused by a poor harvest. The single state again fell apart, each of which had its own ruler. So Pharaoh became a purely normal figure. By 2040 BC, the ruler of the city of Phiva, by 2040 BC or by 2040 BC, the ruler of the city of Memphis, not to be confused with the Greek Memphis, managed to unite the country under his authority, after which began the Middle Kingdom era. This period lasted 250 years. Around 1700 BC, tribes known as the Hyksos invaded Egypt. Hyksos means shepherd kings. Gysos, or the Hyksos, seized power in Egypt and ruled the country. The Hyksos seized power in Egypt and ruled the country under the name of their own dynasty. It is believed that the Hyksos tribes were of Semitic origin. It was under this Asiatic dynasty that the biblical captive Joseph arose, who went from the slave to the post of prime minister of Egypt, and his relatives who came to Egypt for bread, fearing the famine raging in Canaan, formed the basis of the future Jewish people. It was the dynasty of Hyksos that could patronize. It was the dynasty of Hyksos that patronized Jews in Egypt, since both Hyksos and Jews united under a common Shemitic roots. After the expulsion of the Hyksos, the Egyptian dynasty again replaced their dynasty, and Jews in Egypt fell out in favor, which led to their mass exodus from Egypt. The rule of the Hyksos is called the Second Transition Period. After the expulsion of the Asiatic Hyksos in 1550 BC, the so-called New Kingdom, the period of greatest prosperity in the history of ancient Egypt, happened. It was at this time that the most famous pharaohs ruled: Ramesses II, Tutmosis, and no less than the famous queen Nefertiti. This period lasted 500 years. Persian period. In 528 BC, Egypt was captured by the king of Persia, Cambyses, and turned into a Persian satrapy. Greek period. In 332 BC, Egypt was conquered by Alexander the Great and became part of his empire. On the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, Alexander founded the city in honor of himself, Alexandria of Egypt, which became the capital of Egypt. It was at this time that the legendary Alexandria Library was created and was of the most extensive collection of manuscripts. The Septuagint was also translated in Alexandria. It was the most extensive library existing at the time. After the death of Alexander the Great, 4 of his empires were divided among his generals. Commander Diadochi. That's why the period of division and conflict after Alexander the Great is known as the Wars of the Diadochi, Egypt came under the control of Ptolemy, who became the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty. To the reign of Queen Cleopatra the 7th or the 8th, the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty rulers, Egypt was drawn into political intrigues in Rome. After the defeat of the Egyptian fleet in a battle in the eastern Mediterranean in 30 BC, Cleopatra committed suicide. Her favorite admirer, Mark Antony, also died, rushing into the sword, killing himself, after which Egypt became a Roman province. The final stage of pre-Islamic Egypt was the Byzantine period. In 395 AD, Egypt became part of the Byzantine Empire and stayed in it until 642. Society structure. At the top of the social ladder of the state stood the monarch, pharaoh. Originally, the word Pharaoh meant the great house or the royal palace, and only in the era of the New Kingdom did this value pass on to the ruler of the country. Prior to this, the ruler was called king or lord. Pharaoh was also considered the supreme commander-in-chief. Pharaoh had several signs of royal power: a double crown, symbolizing the united power over upper and lower kingdoms. It consisted of a red crown made in the form of a cobra, a symbol of Lower Egypt, and a white crown made in the form of a falcon, a symbol of Upper Egypt. Scarf. is considered the usual headgear of the Egyptians, which had a different color depending on the social status of the owner. The royal headscarf was golden with blue stripes, braided on the back in the form of a braid. A crown was put on top to him. Scepter, with a curved end, a symbol of power. Spill, the right to punish the rebellious. Artificial beard symbolizing male power. There's actually an artificial goatee. It was these symbols that were depicted on the sarcophagi of the pharaohs during their burial. Pharaoh was considered the embodiment of God, and his deceased predecessor, the embodiment of the god Osiris. Egyptian administration. Egypt was divided into 42 administrative districts, nomes or noma. At the head of each district stood nomara, representative of the pharaoh. He performed administrative functions, monitored the collection of taxes, and conducted court cases. A step below the pharaoh stood various officials and scribes, comprising the higher society of Egypt, or the white skirt class, received this name on white linen clothes, the sign of a privileged estate. Priests were very important figures. They wrote laws and letters, kept tax records, created libraries, calculated expenses, and conducted households. In a word, they were the media of ancient Egypt. Even lower stood priests, who ruled the temples and complex and confusing religion of ancient Egypt. Then down were the soldiers, army of ancient Egypt. Warriors in Egypt were armed with bows, arrows, and spears. The weapon was made of bronze. Shields were made of hard wood. During the New Kingdom, Hyksos, who invaded Egypt and seized power in the country, introduced war chariots into the army. Even lower than the soldiers were artisans, cooks, potters, blacksmiths, hairdressers, weavers, jewelers. These included people of creative professions, sculptors, artists, musicians. Agriculture was the foundation of the Egyptian economy. Most of the population of Egypt was made up of peasant farmers, since the economy of Egypt rested exclusively on agriculture. Although Egypt itself was surrounded by a lifeless desert, the Nile Valley was a kind of man-made green oasis. Flood season, lasting from June to September, left a layer of sludge on the surface of the earth, which served as a very fertile soil. With the help of artificial ponds and reservoirs, the Egyptians retained flood waters and used them during a drought which lasted with October to February. To this end, a whole system of dams and irrigation canals was built, with many branches that supplied the fields with water. The Egyptians grew barley, garlic, melons, zucchini, leeks, grapes, and linen. Wine was made from the grapes, and threads were hidden from the fibers of the linen, and linen clothes were woven. Local olive trees made it possible to produce vegetable oil from olives. Slavery. In the 4th millennium BC in Egypt, a slave holding system was formed. The slaves were at the very bottom of the social ladder. As a rule, these were prisoners captured during the wars. At first, while Egypt consisted of separate tribes, it was unprofitable to keep prisoners, and they were simply killed. So they were called killed. But then Egypt became a developed state. It became more profitable to use captives as a free workforce, so they began to be called living killed. Religion of ancient Egypt. The religion of the Egyptians belonged to the pagan. Like the religions of Greece and Rome, the religion of Egypt was represented by a whole pantheon of the gods. Among them, the main deity was the god of the sun Ra, goddess of nature Isis, and the god of the kingdom of the dead Osiris. The Egyptians believed that after death, a person goes to the court of Osiris, where his heart is weighed in the libra of truth. The heart of a deceased person was placed on one side of the scales, and on the other, pin of the goddess of justice, Maat. Burial of the dead. The Egyptians invented their original way of burial of the dead, mummification. Probably other than people in ancient Peru, the Egyptians were probably the most famous of all of the ancient societies that engaged in mummification. The Egyptians, to do this, they removed the internal organs, and the body was wrapped in a fabric soaked in a special composition. Marriages. It is interesting that it was not customary to consecrate marriages in Egypt with a priest. The Egyptians did not arrange weddings, but simply exchanged gifts. Men could enter marriage to 16 years old, women from 14 years old. The norm was considered a classic monogamous marriage, one husband, one wife. An exception could be made by Pharaoh, who could have several wives. A man could also afford to have a concubine who spoke of his high position. However, women with more than one husband were punished. Interestingly, land ownership in Egypt was transferred through the female line. Therefore, the husband had the right to dispose of the land of the spouse only while she was alive. After her death, the earth passed to her daughter, or the possessions passed to her daughter. Therefore, it was enough to marry the heiress of the throne, and it was possible to rule the whole country. Therefore, Pharaoh usually married his own sisters and daughters in order to own their lands. Pharaoh usually had several wives. His main wife bore the title the king's wife, although in reality, she could be his sister or daughter. Hygiene and appearance. The Egyptians followed themselves very much and carefully observed personal hygiene. The peasants washed in the waters of the Nile. and noble residents took baths in luxurious pools. At the same time, they used soap consisting of a mixture of animal fat and chalk. After washing, a special makeup was applied to the face. The eyelids were covered with green paint, and the eyes were circled with a black line. Both men and women from high society wore wigs. Natural fossil. The land of Egypt was very rich in various natural resources. The Nile Valley contained limestone deposits. The bowls of the eastern desert kept an alabaster, a ventricle, and emeralds. Namibia had rich gold mines. Malachite ore was mined in Sinai, from which they already knew how to melt copper. Painting. Egypt's art is distinguished by a peculiar manner of performance that cannot be confused with any other. The figures of people are depicted very originally. The body and head are sideways, and the shoulders are turned straight. In fact, attempting such a pose is simply impossible, but it is she who is a sign of ancient Egyptian writing. Ancient Egyptian painting. Architecture. The most magnificent buildings of ancient Egypt are, of course, the famous pyramids. The largest of them is the Cheops Pyramid, or Khufra Pyramid, even considered one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Each pyramid is a gigantic construction of stone blocks in the shape of a triangle set to each other. It is interesting that the corners of the pyramids exactly correspond to the sides of the world. The exact purpose of the pyramids is completely unknown. It is assumed that they served as tombs of the pharaohs. The most famous pyramids, Khufra or Cheops, Hafren, and Macarena are located on the Giza Plateau. Arab Caliphate. After about 640, Egypt was occupied by the army of the Arab Caliphate. It was a turning point for Egypt. With the advent of the Arabs, the ancient Egyptian gods were replaced with Monophysite Christianity, and that was replaced by Sunni Islam. So after several centuries, the population of Egypt became almost completely Arab. Ottoman Empire. In 1517, Egypt became part of the Ottoman Empire. It is interesting to note that in 1798, Napoleon took a trip to Egypt for a year to weaken the presence of the British in Asia. He failed in this endeavor. Archaeology. In 1799, a sensational event took place. The famous Rosetta Stone was found. The fact is that the writing of ancient Egypt was practically forgotten by this time, and the meaning of the characters was lost. And so the stele was discovered on which the same text was repeated in 3 languages. Ancient Egypt, demonic writing. Demonic writing is Egyptian written in an alphabetic or in a Phoenician or Greek-inspired alphabet and ancient Greek. Since scientists were well aware of the ancient Greek language, they received in practice a translation from the ancient Egyptian characters into the ancient Greek language. And then in 1914, Egypt turned out to be a colony of Great Britain and remained so until 1936, in which it gained independence. All right, so this is Life in Ancient Egypt. This is from localhistories.org, and this is by Tim Lambert. and it is not protected under copyright, so as far as I can tell, I can use it. I just can't make any money out of it. Yeah, I discussed about the crowns earlier, the Cobra crown and the other crown of Majet or Majit. They were united under Pharaoh Narmer of Dynasty 0, which was 3100 BC. That was the first time that those two sub-kingdoms were united into one kingdom, the Old Kingdom period. The Upper Egyptian crown, the Lower Egyptian crown, and the War crown. Yeah, that's the basis of the pharaonic crown. That was used all the way down to Queen Cleopatra. I think she was the last ruler to actually wear those crowns. And you could combine them together as something, mix plus match, depending on what was appropriate at any given time. Code of Truth says watch the Khaled Maupin and Jason Arui on the Jason Underwood debate. Okay. I thought the debate he had with Mysterium Fasces was better. I thought the debate he had with Mysterium Fasces was actually better myself. So, life in ancient Egypt. Egypt was said to be the gift of the Nile. Each summer, the Nile flooded and provided water to grow crops. For irrigation, Egyptians used a device called shaduf. It was a seesaw with a leather container at one end, which was filled with water, and a counterweight at the other. When the Nile flooded, it also deposited silt over the land near the banks, which made the land very fertile once the water had subsided. The Nile also provided boats, a way of transporting people and goods to and fro. Prevailing winds in Egypt blow south, so boats traveling in that direction use sails. Boats heading north used oars. Egyptian society. Ancient Egypt was ruled by a king. By about 1500 BC, he was called the Pharaoh, from the word per-oa, meaning great house, the house of his majesty. Originally, it was meant the palace he lived in, but it came to mean the ruler himself. The pharaoh was assisted by a kind of prime minister called a vizier. Sometimes there was more than one. Furthermore, for administration, Egypt was divided into areas called nomes. Below the pharaoh were the nobility, priests, scribes, and merchants. Then came soldiers and craftsmen, then peasants, and finally slaves. A slave's life was very hard. Ordinary Egyptians who were not slaves also had to work for the pharaoh each year, building or mending irrigation canals. This was done when the Nile flooded and farm work was impossible. Farmers also had to pay part of their crops to the pharaoh in tax. In Egypt, women had a great deal of freedom. They could come and go as they pleased. They could own property and they could sign contracts. Women could also divorce their husbands. And this is a bust of Queen Nefertiti. However, most women worked in the home. There was a great deal of work to do, as most homes were largely self-sufficient. The women made the family's clothes and prepared food such as grinding grain to flour to make bread. Even in a rich family, the women was kept busy organizing the slaves. There was also women doctors in Egypt, a woman called Sobekeferu Sobi-Keferu ruled Egypt around 1800 BC. Later, a woman named Hatshepsut ruled Egypt circa 1479 to 1458 BC. Another woman, Tuosret, ruled Egypt from 1191 to 1189 BC. Food and farming in ancient Egypt. The staple diet of the ordinary people in ancient Egypt was bread and beer. The bread was baked outside because of the desert sand was often blown into the dough. In time, eating bread with grains of sand in it wore down people's teeth. In ancient Egypt, as in all early civilizations, meat was a luxury, and only the rich could afford to eat it frequently. The Egyptians ate sheep, pigs, cows, and goats, but meat often came from ducks and geese. However, fish were plentiful in Egypt. The Egyptians ate many vegetables, including marrows, beans, onions, lentils, leeks, radishes, garlic, and lettuces. They also ate fruit like melons, dates, and figs. Pomegranates were quite expensive and were eaten mainly by the rich. The Egyptians also grew herbs and spices, and they made cooking oil. Beer was made from crumbled barley bread and barley with water, so it was lumpy. It was strained before it was drunk. Even so, it was still lumpy, so it had to be drunk through a wooden straw with a filter. Better off Egyptians drank wine. Ancient Egyptian farmers dug irrigation canals to take water from the Nile when it flooded and to hold it when the flood subsided. In ancient Egypt, oxen pulled plows, and farmers used simple tools such as hoes, sickles, rakes, and winnowing fans, used to throw wheat into the air to separate light chaff from heavier grain. In Egypt, there were 3 seasons. From July to October, the season when the Nile flooded, was the season that the Nile would flood. Seeds were planted from November to February. The harvest lasted from March to June. Egyptians divided days into 24 hours, and they measured time with water clocks. Water was allowed to drip into a container at a steady rate. The container was marked at intervals, and it took 1 hour for the water to rise from one mark to another. Like all early civilizations, ancient Egypt was an agrarian society. Most people lived in the countryside and made their living by farming. The most important crops were wheat and barley. Clothes in ancient Egypt. Not surprisingly, given the hot climate, Egyptians wore only light clothing. Men wore a loincloth and a kind of kilt. Women wore dresses with shoulder straps. Clothes were made of linen or cotton. Later in Egyptian history, clothes became more elaborate and colorful. Egyptians shaved their hair and wore wigs. Children had their heads shaved to prevent lice, although they usually had a braid left on the side of their heads. It was normal for children to go naked. Most people went barefoot much of the time, but they sometimes wore sandals made from papyrus. Egyptians wore jewelry. Those who could afford it wore jewelry of gold, silver, and precious stones. Poor people wore jewelry made of copper or bronze. Both men and women wore makeup. Houses in ancient Egypt. Rich Egyptians lived in large, comfortable houses with many rooms. Walls were painted and the floors had colored tiles. Most wealthy houses had enclosed gardens with pools. Inside their homes, rich Egyptians had wooden furniture such as beds, chairs, tables, and chests for storage. However, instead of pillows, they used wooden headrests. Toilets consisted of a clay pot filled with sand. It was emptied regularly. Ordinary people in ancient Egypt lived in simpler homes made of mud bricks with perhaps 4 rooms. People may have slept on the flat roof where it was hot, and they did most of their work outside because of the heat. The furniture was very basic. Ordinary Egyptians sat on brick benches around the walls. They used reed chests or wooden pegs on walls to store things. Pastimes in ancient Egypt. For entertainment, the Egyptians loved parties. If a rich person invited you to a feast, you would be entertained by singers, musicians, dancers, jugglers, wrestlers, and jesters. Musicians played with wooden flutes, harps, lutes, drums, and clappers. At a rich person's banquet, guests were given a cone of perfumed fat to put on their heads. It slowly melted, leaving the wearer smelling nice. Egyptians also loved hunting and fishing. For the rich, hunting was a pleasure. For the poor, it was for food. Men caught birds with nets or by throwing curved sticks. Fish were caught with hooks or harpoons. Men and women went swimming. Men also enjoyed boxing, wrestling, and archery. They also played a game that involved standing on a boat and trying to knock the opposing team into the water with a stick. Egyptians also played a board game called Senet. The board was divided into squares with counters. You threw sticks rather than dice. Ancient Egyptian children played similar games to the ones children play today. They also played with dolls, toy soldiers, wooden animals, balls, marbles, spinning tops, and knuckle bones, which were thrown like dice. Education in ancient Egypt. Most boys and girls in Egypt did not go to school. Instead, boys learned farming and other trades from their fathers. Girls learned sewing, cooking, and other skills from their mothers. However, boys from wealthy families sometimes went to school and learned to be scribes. They learned by copying and memorizing, and the discipline was strict. Teachers beat naughty boys. The boys learned reading and writing and also mathematics. Girls from well-off families were sometimes taught at home. Ancient Egyptian writing consisted of symbols called hieroglyphs. Originally, they were pictures, but in time they evolved into standard symbols. However, the hieroglyphs were very complicated, and so they were only used for religious books and for carving on buildings. For everyday use, a simpler form of writing called hieratic was developed. Weapons in ancient Egypt. Egyptian soldiers went into battle protected only by wooden or leather shields. They fought with spears, swords, axes, daggers, and maces. They also used slings and bows and arrows. Most men fought on foot, but after about 1700 BC, the army also had war chariots. Each chariot carried 2 men, one to drive and one to shoot arrows. In ancient Egypt, horses were mainly used for war. Donkeys were used as pack animals. Only the most important soldiers wore armor made of bronze. Prisoners of war were usually made slaves. Medicine in ancient Egypt. The first doctor ever known in history was the Egyptian Sakhet Eyanek, Sikhet Eyanak, who healed the pharaoh's nostrils. We do not know what was wrong with them. Much of Egyptian medicine still relied on magic. However, at least they could keep written records of which treatments worked and which did not. In this way, medicine could slowly advance. The earliest known medicinal book or medicine book is the Ebers Papyrus. Ebers Papyrus, which was written about 1500 BC. Doctors in ancient Egypt used a huge range of drugs obtained from herbs and minerals. They were drunk with wine or beer, or sometimes mixed with dough to form a pill. Egyptian doctors also used ointments for wounds, and they treated chest complaints by getting the patient to inhale the steam. The Egyptians believed that the human body was full of passages that acted like irrigation canals. The Egyptians knew that irrigation canals sometimes became blocked. They reasoned that if the passages in the human body became blocked, it might cause illness. To open them, Egyptians used laxatives and induced vomiting. However, the Egyptians still believed that spells could help the sick, and they carried amulets to ward off disease. Nevertheless, they were beginning to seek a physical cause for illness. The Egyptians did have some knowledge of anatomy for making mummies. To embalm a dead body, they first removed the principal organs, which would otherwise rot. However, ancient Egyptian surgery was limited to such things as treating wounds and broken bones and dealing with boils and abscesses. The Egyptians used clamps, sutures, and cauterization, burning with red-hot metal. They had surgical instruments like probes, saws, forceps, scalpels, and scissors. They also knew that honey helped to prevent wounds from becoming infected. It is a natural antiseptic. They also dressed wounds with willow bark, which has the same effect. The ancient Egyptians were a clean people. They washed daily and changed their clothes regularly, which must have helped their health. Egyptian religion. The ancient Egyptians were polytheists. That is, they worshipped many gods. Gods and goddesses were usually depicted as human beings, though sometimes they had animal heads. Among ancient Egyptian gods were Amun-Ra, the sun god and the leader of the gods. Nut was the sky goddess. Her brother Geb was the earth god. Osiris was in charge of the underworld. His wife was Isis, and his son was Horus, who was sometimes depicted with a falcon's head. Hathor was the goddess of joy. Hathor was the goddess of joy and love. She was also the goddess of music and dance. They also worshipped Anubis, god of the dead and mummification. He was a man with a jackal's head, and Egyptians believed he guarded the places where the dead were buried. Other gods included Thoth, a man with a ibis, and Ibis, a man with an ibis head. who was the god of the moon and wisdom. Path, Pitah, Pa or Pitaf was the god of craftsmen. Taweret, a pregnant hippo, was the goddess of childbirth. Maat was the goddess of justice and truth. Hapi was the god who made the Nile flood. The ancient Egyptians had a goddess of reading, writing, and arithmetic also. Her name was Shishat. The ancient Egyptians believed that the gods lived in temples. The god's spirit was believed to inhabit a statue. 3 times a day, priests cleaned the statue, changed its clothes, and placed fresh food before it for it to eat. After a while, priests removed the food and ate it. After death, Egyptians believed they would be judged. Their heart was placed in a balance, or on a balance scale, and weighed against an ostrich feather, a symbol of truth and justice. If the heart was good, it would balance the feather, and the person was granted eternal happiness. If it was evil, the feather would outweigh it. In that case, the heart was fed to a monster called Anmet, who was part lion, part crocodile, and part hippopotamus. If Anmet ate your heart, you cease to exist. Ancient Egyptians tried to preserve dead bodies by mummifying them so the owners could use them in the next life. The dead were also buried with grave goods to use in the next life. Animals, especially cats, by the way, cats were highly revered in Egypt, were also mummified. To mummify a body, the Egyptians first removed its internal organs, otherwise they would rot. They rinsed the cavities with palm wine, then covered the body with a salt paste called natron to dry it. After 70 days, the body was washed and wrapped in linen bandages. And this is an Egyptian sarcophagus. All right, so that is it. And finally, just as an extra little gift, here is some Egyptian poetry. This poem is simply called Plowing and Sowing. Yes, I know. Very original, huh? Very original name, but whatever. I don't know why they would just name it by the act. But anyways, this is the plowing and sowing parable. A fine day. One is cool. The oxen are drawing. The heaven is doing according to our hearts. Let us work for the noble. Hasten, leader, forward with the oxen. Behold, the prince is standing and looking on. Friend, hasten at the work. Let us finish in good time. I shall do more than the work due to the noble. Be silent. The prince, Paharai, deceased, proceeds to load the barges in the river meadow. He says to the farm laborers, hasten ye, the cornfields are broken up. The Nile was very great. Say, we are doing so, behold us. Fear not the cornfields, they are very good. Twice excellent is your exclamation, my son. The year is good, free of ills, healthy in all, herbs, and the calves are excellent beyond anything. And this is reaping. If you bring me 11,009 sheaves, I am the man to strip them all. Quick, do not chatter, you old quack of a laborer. In answering chant they say, this is a good day. Come out unto the land. The north wind has come out. The sky is doing according to our heart. Let us work and bind firm our heart. Give me a hand. Behold, we shall come in the evening. Do not repeat the meanness of yesterday. Cease it today. And this is threshing. Hasten ye, quicken your feet. The water is coming and will soon reach the baskets. The sun is hot. May the sun be given fish in payment for the corn. Does not the pole stand all day on my shoulder very firmly? That is my wish. Thresh for yourselves. Thresh for yourselves. Oxen, thresh for yourselves. Thresh for yourselves. Straw to eat. Corn for your masters. Let not your hearts be still. It is cool. These scenes and hieroglyphic inscriptions date to circa 1400 BC, during Egypt's 18th dynasty. They depict a scribe, Pahiri, inspecting agriculture in the Nomi, a type of territorial district in ancient Egypt, which he ruled south of Luxor. They are found in the south end of the west wall in the main chamber of his tomb. So, as you probably likely guessed, Egypt was very much an agrarian society with a lot of slaves and a lot of farm laborers. But they were the first, at least in written history, to deal with irrigation, with basic irrigation techniques. They were the first to use star charts to count the day into 24 hours. They were the first that we know about, at least historically, that plowed fields with domesticated animals like cattle and so forth. And so when it comes to a lot of firsts in the story of civilization, the Egyptians did it first. So thank you for watching. Code of Troops says, Forge! Gang! Yeah, and that was the riddle of the Sphinx. It's called the riddle of the Sphinx. It's actually not Egyptian, it's actually Greek in origin. It was actually a Greek who went to Egypt that came up with that riddle. It's a very old riddle too, also. Code of Truth, watch the Calab Maupin Jason Underwood debate. This is my wish. What's up, Frederick 1483? How are you doing, brother? Sup, brother? How are you doing, man? Let's see here. Do you know about the Egyptian crowns? Yeah, I did that at the beginning of the stream. Upper Egypt, Southern Egypt, the war crown. Yeah, I'm familiar with the crowns of Egypt. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the crown of Lower Egypt, which is white, the crown of Upper Egypt, which is red. And this is the Nemes, and war crown. So yeah, very ancient stuff. Frederick 1483, and you could combine them together or something mix plus, match depending on what was appropriate at any given time. That is really interesting to know. Oh, I'll have to check the VOD. You know your stuff, man. Thanks, bro. Thanks. Just rewind it a bit. You started with it basically, lol. Esoteric archivism, were they whites? They were Mediterranean. They were Mediterranean people. I don't know what you mean by white. They were Mediterranean. Finding Freedom, the Greek Septuagint is a more accurate translation of the Old Testament from the Masoretic Hebrew translations. Where were you when I did my previous stream? When I did talk about some of that. So you should have commented with this on that stream and not on this. This is about daily life in ancient Egypt, and also I'm finished. All right, thank you for watching. Peace out.